Grüß, willkommen in einem Anwendung video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 44 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case I'll be looking at how I created my initial 6mm Napoleonic force mix, which I only just completed. From bitter experience I've learned that when you decide to try out a new scale and period of figure gaming, you need to do your research. For my 6mm World War II force mix, I've been forced to rebase 3 times and have dramatically changed the figure type ratios to accommodate the scale and rules I ended up playing the most. The result is I have a vast number of figures which I know I will never use. My 15mm Napoleonic Prussian force mix, while not as bad as my World War II 6mm force mix, has been rebased 3 times as well, and the figure ratios are so out of whack with the rules I use right now. Once again, there's no way I'll ever be able to field more than a fraction of, for example, my Prussian cuirassiers. If you do not do your research up front, you will waste a large amount of time, money and effort. If that's what you want to do, then go ahead. But if you don't want to do that, then do your research. When I recently built out my additional Napoleonic force mixes, specifically my 15mm Napoleonic Austrian, French, British and Prussian force or Russian force mixes, I applied these lessons and the results have been surprisingly good. Now that we've ascertained you need to do a lot of research in order to select a new scale and period, possibly another question that needs to be answered, probably before the research question, is why bother doing this new scale period? If you have no figures and like the period in question, then that part of the question has been answered. As for selecting the scale, that's harder to answer and requires more research. But assuming you want a specific scale because of a good reason, then the 2 questions have been answered: why you should consider a new period and scale. On the other hand, if you already have a 15mm Napoleonic force mix, why should you consider getting a 6mm Napoleonic force mix? In most cases, the answer is there is no point, so why bother doing it? Assuming you have a 15mm force mix, and you have opponents that use that scale, and you have played obviously many games, then there may not be a reason to try a new scale in the same period. One answer could be you want a new force mix and feel 6mm, for example, is cheaper and easier to paint up. Later in the video I'll discuss why this may not be a correct assumption, but from the surface it does seem reasonable. Another reason is you meet a new group of gamers which use a different scale. You may wish to join that group, and that requires a new force mix. This is a very good reason to flip to a new scale, particularly if you've already got a different scale in the same period. Another more esoteric reason is there's something about the scale you are using you do not like. This normally dovetails into the rules being used, but is another valid reason if you've actually identified there is something really specific about the scale that you're using that you really don't like. I used to use 25mm figures, but when I saw 15mm figures, I left the 25mm scene and went to 15mm, even though the rules I was actually using was identical. I can't remember exactly why I did this. I think it's because I felt I could have bigger battles, but there was a powerful driver for me to do the flip. In the opposite direction, I know a player who went from 15mm to 25mm because he liked specific regiments and wanted to paint up his desired regiments in a 25mm scale because he felt it looked better. So in that case, they went from 15 to 25 because they wanted better looking figures. Another valid reason. However, putting these reasons to one side, which aren't really that firm, they're more a personal preference, most of the reasons driving people to flip to a different scale is the rules. Something about the rules favour a specific figure scale and basing, And in order to use those better rules, you needed to flip to a different scale. This is the main reason I've decided to create a 6mm Napoleonic force mix. Whatever the reason, make sure you have a good one for the period and scale you wish to adopt, because creating a new force mix is not an easy job. The next factor we need to consider is rules. Make sure you have one or more sets of rules in mind when you get your new force mix. Preferably you should be playing or have played a number of games using those rules and have decided you like them and know there is a gaming community you can be part of. The reason why you want to select more than one set of rules is because you may decide after playing several games you actually don't like those rules and want to try a different set of rules, or alternatively you don't have a community of gamers to play in the rules that you want and you have to go to a new set of rules in order to adopt or be adopted by a new group of gamers. Now, the one reason why it's so important in selecting the rules up front is that it will influence how you base your figures. In the Napoleonic area, basing seems to fall into three general groups: the 3cm square or 1 inch square, the 4cm wide and 2 to 4 centimeters deep, and the last group, which is the 6cm wide with varying depths. Some of these specific sizes are based on the scale you use, so 25mm will obviously use 6cm wide bases. But strangely enough, in some cases, 6mm also uses 6cm wide bases, and this is reasonably popular. 6mm also uses 4cm wide bases, although this tends not to be that common. And finally, 6mm does commonly use 3cm square bases, which is probably the second most common basing for 6mm. If you currently possess 15mm Napoleonic figures on 4cm wide bases, basing your 6mm figures on the same makes minimal sense. In this situation, you'd be probably better to base on a 6cm wide base or a 3cm square base. The option after an enormous amount of research was I selected the 3cm square bases, with the option of using movement trays to give me a 6cm wide base. That way, if I had made an error, I could still flip over to the 6cm wide base system. And in turn, what it also allowed me to consider was to use the same set of figures for different sets of rules which use those different basing systems. So I achieved maximum flexibility in this particular case by selecting 3cm square bases. On the other hand, I do understand if a player wants to create mini dioramas with their 6mm figures, which I have to admit look absolutely spectacular, then a 6cm square base may give them the best solution. But I decided not to go down this path and instead went down the 3cm base sizes, and I used my 3cm bases to create dioramas. Now, they're not as good as if you created the diorama on a single 6cm square base, I have to admit that, but my main driver was a mix between having a game and also good look, and that's why I went down the path that I went down. The rules I decided to focus on was Bloody Big Battles, specifically for Napoleonics, and Age of Eagles. In addition to those two sets of rules, I also wanted my figures to be able to be used with Blucher and a figure game version of the SPI board game Napoleon at War, which I have been using quite a bit lately. These are all rules designed to allow you to refight entire historical battles of up to 100,000 men, if not more in some cases. While I did focus on these rules, the simple answer, if you're interested in skirmish games, you are not going to be interested in 6mm. 6mm is all about recreating historical battles, and if you prefer to refight smaller conflicts, then other scales are better suited. That's why, when I was considering 6mm, the sets of rules that I was looking at all supported historical large battles. Most importantly, all these four rules that I've mentioned support base widths, which are 3cm square or 1 inch square, or even in some cases 2cm square. The only exception is Blucher, and in this case I use movement trays. Regardless, in Blucher, the figures are almost irrelevant, so it's all about deploying the cards in such a manner to look good. There are other rules that I'm also considering: Snappy Nappy, Volley and Bayonet, and Marshal of the Empire. I have no idea if these rules support the base sizes I'm using, but if it does not, then I still have my core 4 sets of rules to use with 6mm. And anyway, if they can't be used with 6mm, I can always bring out my 15mm figures for these rules. The other point, even though some rules specify particular base sizes, you can always do house rules to support different base sizes. Of course, when you use house rules, that's not very useful if you're looking for other opponents, so it's only something that you would do if you want to test these rules. So, ultimately, before you buy any figures, you need to identify sets of rules which will be suitable and decide on some form of basing which allows you to use those rules. It's also important to consider flexibility in case you need to move over to a different set of rules that you may not be considering at the present moment. We've covered the rules aspect and some of the other aspects related to research. Now let's look at a couple of common reasons players move to 6mm. That is, the perception the armies are cheaper and easier to paint. Let's first look at cost. Whether you're using 15mm or 6mm, the number of elements would be about similar. So let's compare the cost of a typical elements in both scales, at least for infantry. In the world of 15mm rules, an infantry element would typically consist of 4 figures. At Lancashire Games, a packet of 8 line infantry cost £3.75p or £1.87p per element. There are more expensive 15mm providers, but this is a range I currently use as I feel it gives me a reasonable figures at a reasonable cost. For 6mm figures, a typical base requires 12 figures. There are many different basing systems. I'm just comparing the basing system that I've selected. Each player will need to make their own calculation using whatever basing system they may happen to have selected. A packet of 96 6mm figures from Buckers costs £6.67p if you live outside of the UK, which means each group of 12 figures costs about 84p, or it costs 84p to populate an element. This is cheaper, but not a whole lot. While there is a reduction in cost, we do need to factor a certain inbuilt inefficiency when you purchase 6mm figures. Each packet of 6mm line infantry gives me 8 elements. If I want 8 bases or not, whether I want 8 bases or not. With cavalry it's even worse. You end up with a lot of unnecessary figures when buying 6mm cavalry. Because of this inefficiency, that is, you end up with figures you don't need simply because the 6mm packet size are so large. 6mm cheapness is not as effective or not as real as possibly we initially expected. It's still lowering costs, but when I created my French army, I did not pay much less with 6mm compared with 15mm. To make it even worse for me, when I purchased my 15mm Lancashire figures, they were on special. So when I got my French and my Austrian and Russian army, the 15mm force mixes each were cheaper than my 6mm force mix because I wasn't getting the advantage of a special with my 6mm force mix. Let's look at the next reason people go down the 6mm force mix. That is, it's easier to paint up 6mm figures. This is certainly the case for ancient. As I do have an ancient figure army, and I have to say it is a lot easier painting up 6mm ancient figures than 15mm ancient figures. However, when I started painting up my Napoleonics, I spent almost as much time painting up an infantry element in 6mm than 15mm. And the reason is simple: painting 4 figures versus 12 figures. With Napoleonics also, which is the reason why it makes it worse, you still really want to paint the pants different from the jacket, and you want to have all sorts of, the backpack a different colour, and you want the face, and there's a lot of paints or colours that you place even on a 6mm figures. Not as much as a 15mm figures, but you're doing 12 versus 4. Saying all that, 6mm is, when you really come down to it, slightly easier to paint than 15mm, but certainly not as much as you would expect. And whatever saving you get from 6mm in terms of ease of painting is generally eliminated when you base the figures. I find basing 6mm figures far more effort than basing 15mm figures. In conclusion, don't go down the 6mm path because you think it's cheaper or easier to paint. You need another reason. Now, I went down the 6mm path not because it was cheaper or easier paint. And as it turned out, those benefits were not as great as I originally expected. I went down this path because I wanted to try a new basing system, using in this case 3cm square bases. I am uncertain if this new basing system will give me the benefits I'm hoping for, and that is something I'll only find out once I play some games. But I did have a very solid reason to go down this path. For example, based on the rules I use, I see little benefit in going down the 6mm path for ancients. Perhaps in the future I'll find a set of rules which will need a new base size for ancients, but in this case I have identified no sets of rules which require 3cm square bases, which give me a tangible benefit over my current 4cm wide bases. We have ascertained why we're going down this path. Now the next step is that you need to carefully determine what you need to purchase. When I purchased my 6mm figures, I was uncertain what basing I was going to use. So I purchased more figures than I originally expected, and is another reason why my initial French army ended up being so surprisingly expensive. Originally I wanted to base my 6mm in the manner that you see here. 2 rows of 6 figures each with some skirmishes in front. The first problem I found was Bacchus provides the figures in nice strips of 4 figures. When I cut one strip in 2 and tried to fit 6 figures in a row, it was very, very tight. The other issue was the effect I was trying to achieve, a diorama effect with skirmishes in front. This didn't actually work out as well as I originally hoped because the bases were too small. If you were basing on 6cm square, you could achieve more of the diorama effect. So I discovered that the benefits weren't there and there were some unforeseen problems. This perplexed me for a while, and I asked some of my gaming opponents what the best solution was. My main gaming opponent suggested that each base would be better representing a unit rather than a line. As you can see here, that is 3 rows of 4 figures. While it's true line formations are used in battle quite a bit, a typical Prussian or French brigade or division mainly consisted of columns for most of the battles, so depicting your entire army as all lines with skirmishes in front may not actually be historically accurate. The other advantages of using this scheme is that I end up with 3 ranks, which kind of feels right. I make no claim that this system is optimal, but for my 3cm square bases it works for me, and that's what I adopted. My next issue was cavalry. My ancients 6mm figures are based in a single line of 2, 3 or 4 figures. However, I wanted to try and see if I could get 2 rows of 3 figures, and discovered with Bacchus they fitted. It seems Bacchus specifically designs their cavalry to fit on a base 1.5 centimetres deep, unlike the H&R ancient cavalry figures which I possess, which can only fit in the formation you see here with a lot of fiddling. Moving to artillery, that's not really an issue, and I placed a single gun on each base with 4 crew. The horse artillery also contained a horse figure, so I knew it was a horse artillery unit. For blucher, I use a homemade movement trays. These trays are easily made with 3mm MDF sheets, cut as required with a handsaw, and then using 3mm square balsa strips, which are cut and glued as required, as you can see here. What you see here are my 4 slot trays with 2 spots at the rear which can hold dice to indicate elan, and a spot for the formation name in between. When the enemy is unaware of the unit, the formation name is placed face down in the slot and only flip when the formation becomes known. Typically, I do not populate the trays with figures when it's unknown, and only when it's discovered do I actually put the figures, for obvious reasons. The terrain that you see here on this playing area is not designed for Blucher. In this case, all the terrain features would need to be as large as the movement tray. And I do have those terrain pieces, it's just I wasn't setting up my figures to play Blucher in this particular case. I was setting it up to play Napoleonic War. Now we come to the purchase stage. After much consideration, the system I used was I needed 2 packets of heavy and 2 packets of light cavalry, which gave me much too much cavalry, but did give me all the important dragoons, cuirassiers, hussars, and other light cavalry that I needed. This gives me 8 elements of dragoons, 7 of cuirassiers, 6 of hussars, and 6 of light cavalry. The remaining light cavalry figures were based 3 to a base to represent skirmishing cavalry. I also did get other cavalry, a packet of lancers, which were absolutely overkill, but they did look nice. I also got 2 additional packet of cavalry, which I haven't bothered to paint because I simply do not need this number of cavalry. For the artillery, which comes in packets of 4, I got 1 packet of 4-pounders, 1 packet of 12-pounders, and 1 packet of horse 6-pounders, and 2 packets each of 6-pounders and 8-pounders. This was, once again, gross overkill, and all I really needed was 12 foot artillery and 4 horse artillery, but I just could not resist, and as a result I wasted a lot of money. I based my command figures on 2cm and 3cm circle bases. The 2cm subcommanders consist of 1 to 2 figures, and the CNC 3cm round base commander consists of a tent and some officers. This only required 1 command pack, so in this particular case I did not go overboard and purchase far more than I really needed. I ended up purchasing 6 packet of infantry, which could provide me each with 8 elements. Some of the figures I retasked as light infantry. I created light infantry elements using a combination of line infantry and appropriate skirmish figures in the front rank. As for the Grenadier, Guards and Skirmishers, more overkill occurred. I had to purchase enough packets to give me the minimal number of figures, and I ended up with far too many Guard in particular figures, and even far too many Grenadiers. Because of the scale of rules I used, my objective was to create corps. Actually, a number of corps. In this particular case, I wanted to create 6 infantry corps. Now each corps would consist of 6 line elements, 2 light elements, or 3 light elements, 1 or 2 artillery elements, or 1 or 2 light cavalry elements, depending on the period I'm playing. In addition, there are 3 skirmish elements. This was originally based on DBN, but it does seem to work well with all the other rules that I use, so I continued to adopt it. In addition to the 6 infantry corps, I created 2 cavalry corps. Now, cavalry does vary a bit, so I had to overkill, but a typical corps consists of 2 cuirassiers, 4 dragoon, 1 light, and 2 horse artillery elements. The Guards and Grenadiers were the most difficult and generally would number no more than a half a dozen elements in any battle. Finally, army-level artillery would be added, such as 12-pounders. I planned on a force mix of up to 6 infantry corps, 2 cavalry corps, and 1 Grenadier Guard corps. This should have required no more than 120 elements. As it turned out, I ended up with about 160 elements. The lesson to be learned here is to carefully structure your force mix and try and control your buying impulses. But even if you do so, there is always going to be overkill when you go down the 6mm path. Once I painted everything up and did a couple of test battles, there were a couple of lessons that I really learned. The most important was to make sure the elements can easily be recognised. I found all my infantry looked very similar, particularly from a distance. I did paint the light infantry a different shade of blue, and they, with minimal effort, could easily be identified, but the Grenadier and Guards were much harder to spot. The cavalry was far easier, with each type of cavalry being uniquely painted. This shows a hussar element. The lights are in the first rank, followed by the lines, so you can actually see the different shade of blue that I used for the 2 types of figures. The Grenadiers have a nice white plume on top of their hat, but I found it surprisingly difficult to spot. Perhaps after a few more games I'll be able to recognise it a bit easier. It would have been nice if the figures contained a flag bearer, which I could have easily used to identify Grenadiers and Guards. As for the artillery, there is no way I'm going to be able to spot the difference between a 12-pounder, an 8-pounder, 6-pounder or 4-pounder. Now, luckily for me, it doesn't really matter what the gun calibre is for this particular scale, but if you're using a lower level scale where the gun calibre was important, then I would suggest you need to do something a little bit unique with those figures so you can easily identify the calibres. Another thing which I noticed was the 6mm figures do not seem as photogenic as my 15mm figures. Close up, they certainly don't look anything as good as 15mm, which is, I suppose, expected. But I have to admit, in mass, they do look good. You may have noticed by now that all the pictures that you see in this video seem to only be of one nationality, in this case French. I now need to purchase an Austrian army to act as my opponent to my French army. The issue with dabbling in a new scale is often you may not have initially an opponent, which means you need to create two armies and get other gamers to give it a go. If they like it, then they can go down the track of purchasing their own figures. So in conclusion, with all the lessons I've learned, I will now repeat this whole process to create my opponent to my French force mix. I just hope I have not wasted my time with this project. That's always the biggest fear whenever I go down a new path like this, that is finding out if it actually works and that I can get other players to give it a go. And so this concludes part 44 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case providing an overview of my new 6mm Napoleonic French force mix and giving players some idea of what to watch out for if they're going to go down this particular path. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.